I'm Steve Case. I am a historian of astronomy. I guess a historian of science. I specialize in the history of astronomy. I specifically look at 19th century astronomy. My my book is on the history or the astronomy of Sir John Herschel, who I tell people was basically the Stephen Hawking of Victorian England. So I guess Herschel is my specialty. I teach astronomy and physics and direct a planetarium at a liberal arts college in Illinois called Olivet Nazarene University. And I also write and publish fiction. I think if you asked several different historians, you would get different answers. One answer is that technology is anything that humans add to the built environment, right? So anything that is in the physical world that wouldn't be there if humans hadn't put it there. That could be understood pretty narrowly as physical artifacts, but I think it could also be understood a lot more broadly, including things like language, mathematics. I don't know if we would necessarily consider those all the time. Technology, even things like, and this has been on my mind a lot right now because I'm teaching an introductory astronomy class, calendar systems, right? Our system of measuring time. Those are all technologies that I would argue that we're embedded in, but they're not necessarily physical in the same way that a computer or, I don't know, even something like a chair would be.
Do you have any favorite examples of that stuff that we don't think of as technology, but it is?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that question in preparing for this, and one of the things that kept coming to my mind was domesticated animals. Like, is your dog a piece of technology? I mean, that's a creature that wouldn't exist in that way if we hadn't specifically bred it. We have backyard chickens, and we have 8 chickens, and 3 of them are laying right now, and those breeds do not exist naturally, right? They were bred to do the thing that they do, to give me eggs every day. So that's a form of technology. Even things like agriculture, the way that we not just the tools that we use for growing our crops, but the way that we have bred these crops over thousands of years, domesticated these grasses to become grains. I would argue those are technologies. Well, it really depends on which part of the world you're looking at. So one of the things that I think we really need to be careful about when we talk about technology is that technology is not deterministic, in the sense that any civilization left by itself will develop X, Y, and Z in this order. I think most historians of technology would say it doesn't work that way. So for instance, you could take something that seems like, like the wheel, right? So the wheel is obviously something that needs to be invented first, so you can then have other modes of transportation. But famously, you have entire cultures, like in Mesoamerica, in South America, that they invent the wheel, but it's only ever used for like toys. It never becomes a method of transportation. You have places in the Middle East that invent the wheel and then abandon it because it's just easier to use camels with the terrain there and the distances. So to say which technologies were invented first, I think it would really depend on, like, again, where you're talking about. So things like agriculture, some of the stuff we've already mentioned, were invented in certain places and then spread. Things like calendrical systems, systems of telling time, but again, those developed very differently in very different places, depending on whether you're measuring the motion of the sun or the motion of the moon or some combination of both. So I don't know if it's necessarily that certain technologies are already developed first, but certain technologies perhaps are make their civilization more able to spread, right, to thrive, and then those technologies are sort of carried with that civilization. Yeah, through trade, migration, people moving around, and probably conquests as well, just other cultures adopting those technologies and then adapting them for their own use. But I think, honestly, if we look at how it's developed in history, it's much more contingent. That technology is always embedded in the culture,
Mm.
shaped by the culture, but also by the physical world. And so personally, I think it would be very difficult to say, okay, there's the sequence where first you have stone tools, and then you develop, fire, and then you develop agriculture, and then you develop, metal tools, and then you develop the internal combustion engine, and then you go to the moon. I think that logic seems clear in retrospect, but I think if you actually look at the historical record, it's much, much messier and much more contingent than that.
Well, since there isn't a set sequence of technology advancing, let's talk specifically about what happened here on Earth.
So usually some of the classical things, obviously, like agriculture, the development of agricultural practices, because now instead of having hunter-gatherers, you can settle in one place, you can produce food in a way that's going to sustain a much larger centralized population. The development of writing, right? The development of language, which goes hand in hand with the development of agriculture. Which, interestingly enough, there's a story of, I can't remember if it was Egyptian, the idea that when writing was invented, one of the wise men, or maybe one of the Egyptian gods or something, said, "This is bad because now you will be able to forget," right?
Oh.
Because now you will not have to. You will not hold this in your mind anymore. It will be on a page, and you won't remember in the same way.
That God would have hated Google.
I think so. What other big ones would you put on there? Obviously, you would jump very far ahead. So sometimes in the Middle Ages, there's talk of sort of an early industrial revolution of harnessing things like wind and water to mill grain, right? So the early industrial revolution, often this is talked about in terms of more and more efficient ways of harnessing power.
Mm.
So after wind and water, then eventually you get, again, jumping over quite a bit and simplifying quite a lot, then you get something like the internal combustion engine, where now we can power the industrial revolution. And then probably most people would put the computer revolution on that list as well.
And you don't think it has to happen in that order?
No, I don't think it does. I think you could imagine lots of worlds where it didn't, right? Where you had, just to pick one of those, if you didn't have the material culture for whatever reason to develop writing, and so you had an incredibly elaborate technology of memorization, right? Where you were trained in a different way, and you had these different practices, and there are cultures that have things similar to this, but your technology could have developed in a completely different way, so that it wasn't based on the written word in the same way that our culture is.
So yeah, this is what happened on Earth, but it doesn't have to be that way. You can think of different creative reasons why technology would develop in a different order. The Egyptian god thing is a cool example of technology and folklore and culture interacting with each other, where technology is developed, writing, and people look to their folklore to figure out how to react to it. And I think the Egyptian god story wasn't actually from ancient Egypt. It's from Plato talking about ancient Egyptian gods. So, that's weird, but folklore and technology do interact in fun ways that you can use to your advantage in your world.
For instance, and I think this was actually an idea that you gave me, if we had a different mix of gases in our atmosphere, right? Inventing.
So this one, this slide is about the icebreaker that we did at the beginning of class, actually, thinking what about a world might make it difficult or more likely for different sciences and technologies to actually develop.
For instance, and I think this was actually an idea that you gave me, if we had a different mix of gases in our atmosphere, right? Inventing anything related to flame and ignition might become incredibly dangerous. Mm-hmm. But even things like, well, what if we lived on a planet that was...
Well, that's weird.
I'm sorry. Yeah, my Zoom is acting weird. I'm going to leave and then come back.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, but no, proceed. Don't wait for me.
Okay. Well, now we're recording, so it'll be fine.
Completely overcast all the time, right? Our technologies of timekeeping would be completely different, right? Because we wouldn't have been able to see the motion of things across the sky, the cycle of objects in our sky. But not only timekeeping, navigation and surveying. So surveying as a technology, how you plot the boundaries between different land masses. If you want to know why, when you look at a map of the United States and those Western states have like such neat, perfect straight lines,
Yeah.
that's all astronomy. They're using the positions of the stars to do that surveying. So if you don't have the stars, if you have a completely overcast planet, you're going to develop very different technologies, or certain technologies just aren't going to be able to be invented. If you had a planet with no magnetic field, right, you wouldn't have something like the compass. But if you had a planet with a really, really strong magnetic field, maybe our navigational technology would be even more exact, right? Maybe we would all have a highly acute sense of direction, or, I don't know, completely different instruments for orienting ourselves on the Earth's surface.
Something you said made me think of a question. You were talking about navigation technology with our magnetic field, and that reminded me of a podcast that I listened to recently that had some evidence that dogs can navigate according to the magnetic field, and birds have been shown to navigate with the magnetic field, but that's inherent, like that's a biology thing.
Has our own human evolution shaped the technology that we use? Well, I mean, like, certainly, right? The shape of my mug is because of the shape that my hand evolved in, right? So we have created our own technology to fit with our shape. I did think of an example. All right, so if we lived on a planet with no fossil fuels, right? If we had no fossil fuels on Earth, if we hadn't had this sort of the geological past that provided those for us, renewable energy would be a lot easier to develop, and I would imagine our technology, the efficiency of our solar panels or our wind turbines or whatever would be far beyond what they currently are, because if we wanted energy, we wouldn't have an easier way to get it.
I'm trying to think of a way that there could still be a climate crisis on a world fully powered by renewable sources. I wrote a story like that in college where a government had decided we need more power, so we're going to put solar panels floating in the atmosphere, right. And different geographical regions will have especially designated sun access times. And it was a class warfare thing where because people didn't have access to sunlight, there were huge rates of depression. It was like a depression pandemic.
Whatever world your student create, they'll also find a way to break.
True. I think that's a great exercise, because you have to know how to break a system to understand it really well.
I don't know. I think a lot of people can break the system without understanding it very well.
True. Yeah, but that's the other way around. I think you can break a system without understanding it, but to understand something like in all of its detail, I think you have to also know how to break it. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
So figure out how to break your worlds. Take it to the extreme, and then you'll know when you went too far, and you'll understand your world better. All right. This is self-explanatory. I don't have to give a little intro every time.
I can tell you some things that historians like to be clear did not cause these things, right? So there's the idea that science always sort of is the catalyst for technological advance. But that can't be the case, because most of the technological advances throughout most of human history came about before modern science. And then even when you get into the modern era, you have something like, just to take the example of the engine, the combustion engine, right? That was not developed because we had a good science of thermodynamics. We developed the engine and then developed the science of thermodynamics to understand how it worked. Another thing that is sometimes talked about is, well, necessity, right? We needed this thing, and so somebody had to invent it. But again, there you have lots of examples of of technological developments that were not, and we talked about the car earlier, were not seen as something that was needed. So a lot of this is really hard to pin down. Is it cultural? Is it just a specific individual who looks at the world in a different way? Although that's something that most historians are pretty uncomfortable with as well. Usually they like to point to the famous examples of, here's just an inventor who invented somebody that no one had thought of. Well, usually what happens is when you look more closely at the historical record, they're working in a tradition of development of this problem, and sort of the rest of the things that came before are kind of obscured because their development or their invention or their wrinkle on this development is so successful that we kind of forget about what came before. So I don't know. I'm not sure what the catalyst is for these different things. I think in different situations, you could point to different things.
I actually find that pretty comforting, because if historians don't know of a specific type of event that drives technological advancement, then you can make stuff up. Maybe it's inspiration, like science fiction, which we talked about before. Maybe it's necessity. They need something, so they figure out a way to make it happen. A new understanding of science might get developed. A lot of times people in different parts of the world will create something at the same time. They'll invent something, or a group of people will invent something, but only because there was other stuff in place already that made it possible for that invention to happen. I think the only thing Steve was explicitly clear on was that it's basically never like an individual person creating something in isolation. It's always within the context of what's come before and what do people believe and what do people need and want.
One of the papers that we had to read in graduate school, that we were able to read, that we got to read, that was super interesting actually, was talking about exactly this, the adoption of cars, and how one of the things that people did when they bought their cars, when they got a car on the farm, they said, well, basically it's an engine hooked up to wheels. So let's just drive it out into the field and hook a crank to it and use it to pump water or to do whatever labor we would normally use an engine to do. And industrialists and the people that were manufacturing these were like, no. Okay, that'll be a tractor. Like, we'll create something, but what you need to do with cars is drive them on roads. And the fact is, when they were invented first, and then the need had to be like created for them through marketing and through basically being convinced that you need this thing. And then once that takes off, then the infrastructure is created that then makes it seem inevitable. I would say a lot of places where you see resistance to technology in history, it's because it's seen as a threat to certain values, right? So in England, when the Industrial Revolution is taking off, right? People are resisting and breaking the spinning machines and the technologies that are creating all of these new textile industries, because they're seeing their livelihoods destroyed, right? They're seeing so there it's a resistance to technology, but it's because the values that technology carries are seen to be threatening to this particular way of life. Oftentimes, resistance is seen as hopelessly outdated and old-fashioned, right? And that the new technology is going to be better in every way and just like supersede the old. So the example in this particular study was looking at, I believe it was just after World War I, on airplane technology. And it was wooden technology, airplanes using wood and glue and everything that would be involved, like fancy glues, but like how you would build a composite wing out of wood versus metal aircraft. And retrospectively, metal won out because metal is so much better. But if you look at that moment, technologically, they performed the same. Like there were costs and benefits to both, and there was really no way to objectively say a metal aircraft was better than a wooden aircraft. But the perception was such that metal was high tech, metal was the way to go. And so the funding was cut off for the studies of the wooden airplanes
lots of branding probably went into that.
I'm sure there was a lot of money tied up into it somewhere. And I'm
Yeah.
sure there was a lot of lobbying. There was another example I was reading about. It was the Sony Walkman, the tape recorder, right? When the tape recorder was first invented, like they figured out how to do this, but then it was a question of who wants this? Like what, we have this thing. And so they were trying to sell it to schools as a learning instrument and to like courtrooms so they could record like court proceedings. And it wasn't until people realized, oh, well, we could record music and this would be fun, that it really took off. So again, the technology sort of preceded the need, or the need for the technology to be manufactured. We're talking about like Edison versus Tesla. Who has who's the better salesman, right? Who can promote this technology better? From what I understand, and I haven't looked at that particular episode very closely, but from what I understand, Edison spent a lot of time trying to convince people that the other way of getting energy out was much more dangerous, which wasn't necessarily the case. But when you're talking about technologies that are going to be integrated into infrastructure, then you have a whole nother layer of, okay, well, who do you know in government that's actually going to get this up and running and show that it works in this particular city? Or, who's going to pass the zoning laws, who's going to, so then it gets very complex, because it's not just, I have a better, more efficient way of doing this, but I know the right people that are going to put this into place.
So think about how people will react to your technology in your world. You have to understand what they value, because their reaction will depend on their values and what they're used to, and what technology is already, what technology is incumbent. And so think about that. And that's why you have to think about the values, the culture of the world, and also the history of it, if it's going to feel real, if you're going to have all those details. Any questions so far?
I'm just going to say, I love the earlier example in relation to the opposition of technology. I love the earlier example of the Egyptian god that was supposedly against writing, because I hadn't heard that specific story before, but my understanding was that different people in the ancient world thought this, and they were largely correct, that we did used to have really good systems of memorization. People I know, as an example, I think the ancient Greeks would memorize whole sagas or whatever, and I know the early Buddhist sutras were all just memorized, and people could do that, and that was just a thing people did all the time. And now, with all this technology, that there's a lot of anxiety around how it's changing us, and I think it's one of those things where for me, it kind of highlights the relativity of the question, because it's kind of well, most of us wouldn't want to change things so that we never came up with writing. At the same time, it's valid to say we probably are losing something of ourselves in embracing this new technology. But maybe it'll all kind of sort itself out in the end, and we'll never wish we didn't have it. I don't know, but maybe we still will. A few hundred years down the line, maybe we will be saying yeah, we used to be better at, we used to have longer attention spans.
Yeah.
But we're okay with that because we have crazy technology now.
Right. I mean, I think one of the examples in the fiction that inspires science piece was a brain chip. So maybe one day through technology, we will have artificial memory, in our brains. I mean, what's the difference between storing it yourself in your physical neurons and having access, immediate access, through thoughts to all of the knowledge in the world on the internet?
And I do have this great idea that like humanity became cyborgs as soon as we like started making tools, and specifically the example of writing being like a memory system that is like fundamentally no different than if we had like giant mnemonic memory chips in our heads or whatever, you know. It's like we are externalizing our like what we previously relied on our biology for, we are externalizing into the world, but it's like, and then we become this cyborg.
Yeah.
Just by having a notepad, having a notepad, yeah.
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the possible limit to technology, but it's almost 2. So let's take 5 minutes, get some food, get a drink, go to the bathroom or whatever. And I will see you back in 5. All right, let's bring it back. Cool. All right, limits to technology.
I think most people would agree that technology has, in the past 200 years, advanced at an accelerating rate. And whether that is driven by economies, right? Growing population, growing trade, and also growing scientific advancements. Probably a little bit of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, it seems like there are a lot of like convergent technologies that, because they exist at the same time, make it easier for that rate of advancement to increase. Like the fact that we can travel around the world and we have the ability to communicate with people means that ideas can spread more quickly and we can advance faster. But all of those things have to be in place at the same time.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I think so. So if you understand technology as culture, as cultural expression, then to me it seems like as long as there is human culture, we will be manipulating and adjusting and developing our built environment. Mm-hmm. If you're talking about specific types of technology, like, well, what about plastic and fossil fuel based technology? Is that a bubble waiting to burst? Well, if that technology is contingent on a limited physical resource, then yes, I would say probably. But technology more broadly understood, as long as there is thriving human culture, I would hope that there is technology.
And I feel like when people talk about this topic, they usually bring up a Dyson sphere.
Okay.
Which I don't super love, because there are other ways to get energy than just solar energy. So it's not like we're limited.
Well, and I think it also reduces technology to purely more effective harnessing of energy. Mm-hmm. And to me, that seems a very deterministic and a very reductionist view of technology. If technology is culture, and then things like, I don't know, ways of creating art more effectively, or ways of, I don't know if you can create art more effectively, but right, there's all of these other things that technology can do for us other than just capture energy for us. Mm-hmm. So I agree. That seems kind of reductionist to me.
Just because there aren't real limits to technology doesn't mean that the nature of your world's inhabitants won't lead to some sort of catastrophe related to technology. We do a lot of stuff that's dependent on limited physical resources. So we do have limits to some of our technology, but it doesn't have to be that way. Other worlds are different. Other worlds have different paths to advancement. Right, now about science, which is actually what Steve studies, is the history of science and not the history of technology.
So do the sciences develop in any particular order? Well, they did. But again, is there any reason they necessarily had to, right? And I think I would say probably not. I think I would be wishy-washy and say science is part of culture as well. And you could imagine a world where astronomy never develops, because like we were talking about earlier, if you have a world that doesn't even have to be overcast all the time, maybe has multiple suns, so there's always a sun in the sky. Mm-hmm. So you have here on Earth, you had the development of astronomy. You had a lot of time spent trying to understand the physical patterns of the sky. And then you had the development of mathematics along with that, trying to fit those into mathematical systems. And then you had just this whole messy efflorescence of lots of other things being developed in different directions at different times. You have something like thermodynamics that comes along a lot later, that is, specifically because a new technology has been invented, a technology that's central to this industrial complex that's being developed. So if you don't have fossil fuels, do you ever get the science of thermodynamics? Do you even need it in the same way? Yeah, which is, again, just a fancy way of saying, I don't think there is a specific way that the sciences have to develop. So when we study scientific theories, we want to understand how is that understood in its own time and context? Was it reasonable then based on the evidence that they had, based on their own worldview? So one of the things I do when I teach astronomy is we talk about the geocentric cosmology. And I feel like I'm like hitting the students over the head with, you know, a spherical, unmoving world at the center of the universe was not believed for thousands of years because people were stupid, or because they were superstitious, or because the Bible told them that's how it was, or the church told them that's how it was, but because that made physical sense. Like it fit observation and it fit the understanding that we had of physics. And talking about a planet spinning through space and like going around the star, that doesn't make any sense at all, because that doesn't, we don't feel that, we don't see that. That's really hard to convince someone of. So an understanding of these scientific theories in their own terms as they were understood then, which again, I think could often come up in fiction, where you have maybe not necessarily different worlds at different technological levels, but different worlds with different scientific frameworks, right? Different ways of viewing the universe. So I guess when I say a science, so those are some of the assumptions in our scientific framework, that nature is going to behave law-like, that mathematics, for whatever reason, is going to be a really, really good framework for interpreting our observations. That matter is going to be more or less inert, right? That we're going to, at least in the Newtonian view, which maybe we can question a little bit now. So those are some of the frameworks of modern science. Could you imagine a science that didn't have those frameworks, but that still was doing useful things in the world? Well, now we can kind of talk about technology. Could you imagine alternate technologies where other civilizations outside of the Western experience were thriving, you know, and were doing really well with understanding their own context and their own world?
Yeah, I mean, the first example that comes to my mind is Polynesian wayfarers.
Sure, right.
You know, like they were able to navigate the open seas before anyone else thought it was possible.
Right. So they clearly had technology. They clearly had knowledge. Would we say they had scientific knowledge in the same way because they didn't actually understand what the stars were and like what they were doing? Is that fair? The more careful historical approach would be, let's evaluate what they were doing in terms of that particular context.
And another point I want to make, this is like more of my personal belief, so feel free to take this or leave this, but I like to think of myths as the first science for humankind, or the first framework, the first way of trying to understand the world around them, because that's what myths are for. They help us understand natural phenomena. And then it moved to philosophy, people like Plato, who were thinking about how the natural world works, but we still hadn't developed the modern scientific method the way we think of it today. And just like Stone Age and Bronze Age and Iron Age people can overlap in time, these different ways of understanding the world can overlap in time. And that's why it used to be much more common for brilliant, well-regarded scientists to be religious. Newton, I think, Isaac Newton, for example, thought that God was a mathematician. And so Newton was very into math and science, similar to how we think of it now, but he was also religious. And those two things didn't seem at odds because of Newton's particular worldview, which was kind of caught in between some of these. So you can think of other potential worldviews, other potential ways of trying to explain what's happening around you. And as long as you're internally consistent, as long as it makes sense given the information available to the people at the time, then it won't be unrealistic.